Chapter 19. At lunchtime on Monday, George was sitting quietly in the school dining hall, minding his own business. He got out his lunchbox and looked inside, wishing he could have bags of brightly coloured crisps or chocolate bars or fizzy orange like the other kids. Instead, he had a spinach sandwich, a hard-boiled egg, yet more broccoli muffins and some apple juice pressed by his mother. He took a large bite out of his sandwich and sighed. He wished his parents would understand that he wanted to save the planet as much as they did, but he wanted to do it in his own way. It was all very well for his parents to lead their alternative lifestyles, but they only hung around with their friends who were just like them. They didn't have to go to school every day with people like Ringo and his gang laughing at them because they wore funny clothes and ate different food and didn't know what happened yesterday on the television. He tried to explain this to his dad, but all he heard back was, "We all have to do our bit, George, if we're going to save the earth." George knew this was true. He just thought it was unfair and rather pointless that his bit meant being a figure of fun at school and not having a computer at home. He had tried to explain this to his parents, how useful a computer could be. "But Dad," he had pointed out, "there's stuff you could do on the computer too, stuff that could help you with your work. I mean, you could get lots of information from the internet and organise your marches with email. I could set it all up for you and show you how." George had gazed hopefully at his dad. He thought he saw a spark of interest in his dad's eyes, but it flickered and died. "I don't want to talk about it anymore," his dad had said. "We're not getting a computer, and that's final." That, thought George, as he tried to swallow his lump of spinach sandwich, was why he had liked Eric so much. Eric had listened to George's questions, and had given him proper replies, ones that made sense to George. George wondered if he had dared go round and see Eric later that afternoon. There was so much he wanted to ask him, and also really wanted Eric to check his talk for the competition. Just before lunch, he had finally summoned up the courage to sign up on the board for the science competition, the one with the computer as the first prize. Under topic, he had written, "My Amazing Rock from Outer Space." It looked great as a title, although George still wasn't sure his talk was any good. He'd taken out his lucky rock from outer space out of his pocket while he stood in front of the notice board, but to his horror, he found it was crumbling into dust. It was his lucky charm, the little piece of solar system he had picked up near Saturn. The competition was the very next day as well. George had only been allowed to enter at the last minute because not enough kids from his school had signed up. The head teacher had been delighted to see George writing his name on the board. He bounced up as George filled out the form. "Jolly good stuff, George. That's the spirit. We'll show them, won't we?" He beamed at George. "We can't let Manor Park walk away with every trophy in the area, can we now?" Manor Park was the local posh school, which hogged all the prizes and won all the sports matches with boring regularity. "Yes, sir," said George, trying to stuff his outer space rock back into his pocket. But the sharp-eyed head spotted it. "Oh dear, handful of dirt," he said, grabbing a nearby waste paper bin. "Chuck it in here, George. We can't have you going off to lunch with a pocket full of dust." When George just stood there, rooted to the spot, the head rattled the bin impatiently under his nose. "I was just the same as a boy," he said, a claim George doubted. As far as he was concerned, the head had never been a boy. He'd been born wearing a suit, making enthusiastic comments about the Under-12 Football League. "Pockets full of nonsense, pop it on and off you go, pop it in and off you go." Reluctantly, George dropped the grey, crumbling remains of his most treasured possession into the bin. He promised he would come back later and try and save it. As George munched his way through his sandwich, he thought about Eric and outer space and the competition the next day. While he was thinking, a hand crept over his shoulder and snatched a biscuit out of his lunchbox. "Yum," said Ringo's voice behind him. "Oh, look, George's famous muffins." There was a squelching noise as Ringo took a large bite, followed by a spluttering sound as he spat it straight out again. George didn't need to look round to know that the whole dining room was staring in his direction and sniggering. "Ugh, that's gross," said Ringo, making fake gagging sounds behind him. "Let's see if the rest of it's just as horrible." His hand made another dive for George's lunch, but George had had enough. As Ringo's big paw rootled inside the handmade wooden box in which he kept his sandwiches, George slammed the lid down on his fingers. "Ow!" squealed Ringo. "Ow, ow, ow!" George opened the box again, allowing Ringo to pull out his hand. "What's all this noise?" said the teacher on the dining duty, striding over. "Can't you boys manage to do anything without causing trouble?" "Sir, Dr. Reaper, sir," screeched Ringo, who was cradling his damaged hand. "I was just asking George what he had for lunch when he attacked me, sir, he did." "You better give him a double detention, sir, for the rest of term. He's broken my hand, sir." Ringo smirked at Dr. Reaper, who gave him a cool glance. "Very well, Richard," he said. "Go and see the school nurse and come to my room when she's looked at your hand. I'll deal with George." He ordered him away with a point of a finger, and Ringo slouched away, grinning to himself. The rest of the dining room had fallen silent while they waited for Dr. Reaper to announce George's punishment. But Dr. Reaper surprised them. Instead of giving George an earful, he just sat down next to him on a long bench. "Carry on," he waved a red hand at the rest of the room. "Get on with your lunches. The bell will soon go enough, you know." After a couple of seconds, the usual hubbub started up again, and everyone lost interest in George and went back to their conversations. "So, George," said Dr. Reaper chummily. "Yes, Dr. Reaper?" asked George nervously. "How are you?" Dr. Reaper sounded as though he really wanted to know. "Oh, fine," said George, rather taken aback. "How are things at home?" "They're, well, okay," said George cautiously, hoping Reaper wasn't going to ask him about Cosmos. "And how about your neighbour?" said Dr. Reaper, trying and failing to sound casual. "Have you seen him lately? Is he around at the moment? Or perhaps has he gone away?" George tried to work out what answer Dr. Reaper wanted so he could give him the opposite one. "Perhaps people in the street are wondering where he's got to," went on Dr. Reaper, sounding spookier and spookier. "Maybe it seems he has just disappeared, vanished from view, no idea where he may be. Is that it?" He peered hopefully at George, who was now convinced that there was something very wrong with Dr. Reaper. Almost as though Dr. Reaper sketched a shape in the air with his hand. "He just flew into outer space and never came back? What about that, George? Is that what's happened? What would you say?" The teacher was gazing at George, obviously wanting to hear that Eric had somehow melted into the thin air. "Actually," said George, "I saw him this morning." He hadn't, but it seemed very important to tell Dr. Reaper he had. "Drat!" muttered Dr. Reaper crossly, suddenly getting to his feet. "Wretched boys!" He walked off without even bothering to say goodbye. George closed up his lunchbox and decided to head back to the notice board so that he could look for his rock in the bin. As he hurried down the corridor, he passed Dr. Reaper's study. He heard raised voices and stopped to listen through the door for a second. "I told you to deliver that note," rasped the familiar voice of Dr. G. Reaper. "We did, didn't we?" whined a boy's voice, which sounded all too much like Ringo's. "You can't have done," insisted Dr. Reaper. "You just can't have done." George would have stayed to listen for longer, but then the bell for lessons went, and he desperately wanted to find his special outer space rock before afternoon school began. However, when he got back to the bin, it had been emptied. There was only a clean plastic liner inside. Saturn's mini moon had gone.